Welcome back to another reading update. I have 5 books for you that I've read over the past 2 weeks. I'll timestamp them in the YouTube description so that you can jump around and see the reviews that you're the most interested in. If you're watching this video on Bindery, you might have to then click through to YouTube to see the timestamps in the description, but they will be there. First book that I finished was Understanding Comics. This was a fascinating read and I gave it 5 stars. It's a book on the theory of comics and, of course, appropriately, it's written in comic form. The cartoonist, Scott McCloud, talks a lot about the theory behind making comics. The space between panels, for instance, and all of the different things it can signify. How time moves in comics across panels and how that can be different depending on choices that the cartoonists make. I found especially fascinating his description of the differences between Western comics, American comics, and Japanese manga, and how those differences came to be. He talks a lot about the limitations of the medium and how, like, physically printing things on paper limits the kinds of colors you can use and that sort of thing. So I'd be really interested to hear McCloud's opinions on webcomics, which is the genre I'm more familiar with than traditional comics. I had a webcomic phase when I was in my teens, and what's so interesting about them compared to traditional comics is that they have this essentially infinite scroll and they can reproduce infinite colors, but I'm sure that they have different limitations, limited by the fact that they're on the internet. Understanding Comics doesn't really talk about this because it came out in the 90s, which is pre-peak webcomic time. But if McCloud has talked about it in any of his later work, I'd be really interested to hear what he has to say. The Light of the Jedi was recommended to me by a friend who loves Star Wars, who thought it was a really fresh, new, and interesting Star Wars novel. I read it coming to it as someone who loves space opera but is not at all familiar with Star Wars novelizations and IP, and I didn't like it. As a space opera, the novel starts with its strongest and most explosive action sequence, which is also the inciting incident. A ship is in hyperspace, it gets torn to pieces, and then the pieces start raining down across the galaxy and causing destruction. You see this happening through the eyes of I don't know how many point of view characters. We jump from person to person to person as they all work to prevent this tragedy. Then 100 pages in though, that plotline is done and we continue jumping from person to person to person in the aftermath of the tragedy. And that takes another 300 pages or so. And I like this idea. I like the idea of taking a tragedy and following the fallout. But the problem with starting with your most explosive action sequence is that there's nowhere to go in terms of suspense but down. And there are too many point of view characters for this to feel like a quieter novel about the aftermath of trauma. Like, I should have started counting. I swear there's at least 10 or 12. It felt like the author was told, hey, you have to set up all of these different characters so that we can make spin-off stories about them, and he did the best he could with what he got. So take my opinion with a grain of salt. Again, as someone who is not super familiar with overarching Star Wars IP. I'm familiar with the movies, but that's about it. Just as a space opera though, this one didn't hit for me. The Daughter's War is a grimdark military fantasy prequel to The Black Tongue Thief. I hadn't read The Black Tongue Thief, but I figure it's a prequel, so I'll give it a shot. And indeed, I did just fine. I didn't feel like I was missing any information, and I really liked it. I'm pretty skeptical of grimdark because I don't like when things are depressing just for the sake of being depressing, but I thought it made sense in this context because the premise is that we have this badass lady warrior who's our main character. Her name is Galva, and she fights against goblins by using this giant corvid team. So the story is about her fighting in the war, trying to turn back the tide of the goblins, but it's also about her relationships with the people around her and especially her spirituality. I did think The Daughter's War was a bit of a slow start at first. Galva is a very serious protagonist and we're in first person in her brain, and so sometimes at the beginning I was like, this book is taking itself way too seriously. But as we progressed, some more humorous moments started to come out that really stood out well in juxtaposition with the darker content. Also, I finished listening to the full cast audiobook of Good Omens. This is a bit bittersweet for me. I started the audiobook several months ago, and right as I finished it, I found out about the current allegations against Neil Gaiman, which I will not detail here because it's a long story. I still really loved my time listening to the audiobook though. It's near and dear to my heart. In the full cast version, Crowley and Aziraphale are played by David Tennant and Michael Sheen, and of course they do an excellent job. On the YA side of things, I read The Hysterical Girls of St. Bernadette. This was an arc. It comes out in September. It's a haunted school story as opposed to a haunted house story, because what happens is that At seemingly random, girls in this school will open their mouths and just start to scream, and they can't stop. And the story is set in Malaysia, so our two main characters, who are both Malaysian girls, they have very different backgrounds and experiences though. They attend St. Bernadette's and they have to figure out what's going on, what's causing these screamers, and how can they stop it. What I liked about the story is that it uses the screamers as a way to explore bodily autonomy and recovering from trauma. Also, I realized when I was reading this book, I don't think I've ever read a book set in Malaysia before, so I was so glad that I got to. I also liked that there's bits and pieces of Malay in this book, so I enjoyed getting to see the characters switch between Malay and English. So if you have any recommendations for other books set in Malaysia, I'd love to read more.